I think people would kill me if we didn't get right into Brad Lambert. Dave, you did the game in Montreal a few days ago. Of course, he played again and played a lot, especially late in the game and in overtime, and brought fans out of their seats at Canada Life Center on Saturday night. There's been a lot of talk about this young man. He was supposed to be a very early pick. The Jets somehow was able to draft him at 30th overall. First off, just through the limited amount you've seen him on the ice so far in the exhibition season, what have you been thinking when you've seen this young Finn has the most Canadian name ever?
Well, young Finn is the starting point, right? It's a unique story because there's so much Canadian heritage in him, and he grows up in Finland, comes back for a year, goes back over, well documented with his dad being a player, and his uncle Lane, of course, who's the head coach of the New York Islanders. And I did see him. I did the game in Montreal on Thursday night. So firsthand got to see him, but also got to see him away from the puck. And I like to watch guys in the exhibition that quite frankly, aren't on camera, right? They're away from the puck and how are they doing and what's going on. And you could see the confidence in his game. And that's evident right away. He's comfortable. And you don't say that a lot about 18-year-olds. But if we go back 2 years, my first eyes were on him, I think, as a double underager at the U18s, because I do those games. And he came on like a whirlwind. Well, when someone does it that young, they have 2 full years to pick you apart. And I honestly think that's what happened. I think the expectations were so high for where this kid was going to go. You know, the preliminary draft rankings that came out, yeah, they might have had him in the top 10 somewhere. But you form your opinion over time with that player, and you do your homework on why people are picking him apart, you know, how he may fall to you. And I'll guarantee you, Andrew, the anxious moments between number 14, where Rutger McGroarty was picked, and knowing their next pick was 30, and if they had their sights set on Brad Lambert, as I'm sure they did, if he was going to get there, if you move up to get him, like what's going to happen there? Like all those thoughts would be rushing through their heads. And I'm thinking that group was pretty excited when he was still available at number 30. And, you know, I just think it's the expectations. And when you're that highly thought of that young, I mean, he was playing pro hockey when he was 16. And you can just picture him walking into that grizzled locker room with some of those guys, because I played over there for a year in Sweden. And, you know, when I walked in the locker room for the first time, I'm looking at some legendary veterans, you know, mid-30s, and they'd be looking at this 16-year-old like, who are you and where are you going? But right now he's deciding where he's going. I love when a young kid puts pressure on an organization like this right away. And they've got to put him in the thought process. It's perfect. It's exactly what you're looking for from a young player.
You know, I mean, listen, 2-3 weeks ago when the World Juniors were happening, we were wondering why he wasn't playing in the semifinal and the final game. And certainly, Dave, he had a tough season last year and saw that stock dropped, as you mentioned. Can all of that be erased when you walk into an NHL locker room for the first time and realize, hey, I'm here for a reason? Because he seems to be, we talked a lot about, oh, did he lose his confidence last year? He hasn't looked like he's lacking any confidence so far with the Winnipeg Jets, I'll tell you that.
Well, it didn't in Montreal, and they were down 3-2 in the third period, and Dadonov turned the puck over, and he looked flawless in the way he picked it up, and then the decision he made to shoot the puck when he did. He also had an assist earlier in the game. But, you know, I really believe that a lot of these kids over the last couple of years, with what they've gone through in the pandemic, have just not had normal development curves. And yes, it was different. He was playing in Finland, but still the curve wasn't normal. And now you're saying, from a development standpoint, I like a guy to be a big fish. Now, he'd have been a big fish as a 15-year-old in Finland, but then making the decision to play pro as a 16-year-old, that can go one of two ways. You can lose your confidence through that because you're playing against men. And the best players at some point have to be able to dominate and have to know what that's like. Well, that came when he came and played with his own age group at that age. Because if you think about him, I think might have been the second year at the U17s or the first year at the World Juniors, whatever it was, he was dynamite with his own age group. But you can see that if the Jets are looking at it now, like, well, we maybe have tucked some development challenges that he's already been through, that you might experience for the first time in the American League playing against men. And he's already experienced them. So he's been through some things. I think with the last couple of drafts, we're going to see players taken lower down that were taken lower down for wrong reasons. Didn't get enough viewings. It started so high like a kid like this and dropped. I think it's going to be really hard to judge. And I think you're going to see kids come out of the second and third rounds and late in the first round that, you know, in a perfect world with a perfect environment, which none of us have had over the last couple of years, would have been drafted much higher.
Dave Poulin of TSN's hockey panel with us here on Winnipeg Sports Talk. Dave, so take us inside the brain trust of the Jets right now, seeing what this young man is doing. And I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I think the questions coming out of the World Junior where it was, well, where's the best place for this young man to play this year? I mean, there's a lot of talk that he would go to the Western Hockey League and go back and play junior hockey. There's the potential, because he's a European player, to play with the Manitoba Moose. And I mean, I don't think we've ever had a serious conversation about him maybe sticking around in the National Hockey League, but I'd be lying if there weren't some people hitting me up after the game on Saturday saying, can that possibly be in the cards? This is very, very early, and the Jets have been a team that traditionally has been more conservative when it comes to playing their younger players early. But there's also a new coach in town. I mean, what do you make of all of that around Lambert in particular at this point of training camp with only a couple preseason games remaining?
Well, my answer is yes. But you asked 17 different questions, so it's yes. I think that, okay, the last young player that's come in and forced their hand after 1 year at the University of Michigan, Kyle Connor, like came in, essentially give them no choice, right? Like, I'm playing. And if the player does that, Andrew, that's a perfect world. It's not you trying to force him into the lineup. And like no one forced Brad Lambert in the lineup in Montreal. He was playing, you know, I think he started maybe on the third line. And, you know, and going into the game, no one was predicting by the end of the next game he'd be playing in overtime and doing some pretty cool things in overtime. So I do think that just as you and I, hey, look, you and I are allowed to have this conversation, right? It's a beautiful Monday and we can have this conversation. But this conversation is going on in other places as well. And it might start with the head coach and one of his assistants. It might start over coffee the next morning. And it might be like, yeah, you went back and watched the film. What'd you see? And the answer might be, I saw more good things than we saw during the game. And these are the conversations that go on. And that's exactly what it is. And the brain trust right now, you know, the most interesting one will be when the head coach and the GM sit down and talk about their opening night lineup. Because I know, quite frankly, the mutual respect they would have for each other, and part of Rick Bowness getting the job was the amount of respect you have for him, you know, as a head coach in the National Hockey League and what he's been through. And they'll look for like players that they've played up over the years. You know, it might have been Rick's assistancy in Tampa. It might have been, you know, somewhere as a head coach when they said, yeah, we kept this kid up and it didn't work out, or we kept this kid up and it did work out. So they'll go through all the different machinations of how it may look. Would it shock me on opening night if you were in the lineup? You know, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. And, you know, I think for the Jets to take the next step, they need a couple of kids really pushing, both up front and from the back end. It may be a Cole Perfetti. You know, it may be David Gustafson imposing his way in. It may be Ville Heinola. It may be any one of the above. It may be all of the above. But some of these young players have to force their way into this lineup, Andrew.
Dave, let's say he even gets a couple games, but they feel, hey, 18 years old, not ready for a full National Hockey League schedule. Just in your thoughts, what are the pros and cons to returning to junior hockey or beginning your career as a North American pro playing with the Manitoba Moose, if it comes down to that option for the organization?
You'd have to factor in that he's already played a couple of years pro, and that may trigger it. Where is junior rights held, Andrew? I should know that, and I don't.
It's the out in Seattle.
Okay. So good organization, and you know that's part of it, and where it's going. And you'd have a conversation for sure out of respect to the head coach and the general manager there, and say, you know, what would your plans be? how would it look? Now they'd be champing at the bit, right, to get a player like that for sure. But it's what's in the best interest of the player. And I think each player has to be handled individually. I don't think it's a blanket statement to say, hey, here's what's going to happen. Here's where we're going to go with this every single time. And while the Jets have been conservative with the young players, I gave you a pretty good example in Kyle Connor of one they weren't conservative with. And they'll look at this individual. And just as I said, this may have been a case of a number of scouts around the National Hockey League simply overthinking it.